The ventilator beside my mother made a soft, rhythmic sound, like it was breathing for both of us. I stood in the hallway of St. Augustine's Hospital, my back against the cold wall, trying to hold myself together. Mom had been unconscious for 2 days. The doctor said it could go either way. My hands were trembling when my phone buzzed. It was Raymond Holt, my boss. I assumed he was calling to check on me. He wasn't. "Imani," he said, before I could even speak, "I need to know if you're coming in tomorrow." I told him where I was. I told him my mother might not make it through the week. There was a short pause. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Business doesn't pause for personal problems." He fired me before the call was 3 minutes long. He said my absence was a pattern of unreliability. He said the company needed people who could show up when it mattered. I had not missed a single deadline in 6 years. I had worked weekends, I had skipped vacations, I had answered emails at midnight, and he fired me, standing in a hospital hallway, while my mother lay unconscious 20 feet away. Within the hour, HR sent a termination email. My work laptop was remotely locked. My access badge was canceled. It was fast. Too fast. This wasn't a reaction. This was a plan. Raymond had been waiting for a reason, and my mother's emergency gave him one. I stood outside the ICU door for a long time before going back in. I didn't want my mother to see me shaking. I didn't want her to feel my fear even in her sleep. So I stood there, pressed my hands flat against my thighs, and made myself breathe. I thought about crying. I thought about calling Raymond back and begging. Then something shifted inside me. A quiet, cold decision settled in my chest like a stone dropping to the bottom of a river. I was not going to beg that man for anything. Not today. Not ever. I walked back into that room, sat beside my mother, and held her hand. Whatever came next, I would face it standing up. I had given 6 years to Northgate Capital Group. 6 years of arriving before anyone else and leaving after the lights went off. I had saved 3 major client accounts that were slipping. I had built the analytics reporting system that Raymond now presented at every board meeting. Using my name nowhere in the slides. I had trained 2 junior analysts who were promoted above me, and through all of it, I had stayed quiet and kept working. I told myself loyalty would be rewarded. I told myself the right people were watching. What I never told anyone, not even my closest colleagues, was the thing I had carefully kept separate from my professional life for years. Something I had inherited. Something that was quietly growing. When I was 26, my grandfather passed away and left me a minority stake in Caldwell Osei Investment Partners, my family's private firm. It was old money, patient money. The kind of firm that didn't advertise. We funded corporate expansions, infrastructure projects, and restructuring deals. I had always kept my ownership completely private. I didn't want people treating me differently. I wanted to succeed on my own merit, in my own name, at a company that didn't know who my family was. So nobody at Northgate knew. Raymond certainly didn't know. But 8 months after he fired me beside my mother's hospital bed, that quiet ownership was about to become the most important thing in the room. My mother was discharged 6 weeks after I was fired. She was weak, but she was alive, and that was everything. I moved her into my apartment and spent the first month just taking care of her. Cooking, sitting with her in the evenings, watching old films she loved. It was the most time we had spent together in years, and even through the fear and the grief of the job loss, there was something tender about it. I quietly re-entered my role at Caldwell Osei. I attended board meetings, I reviewed proposals, I asked questions I had been too distracted to ask before. And one afternoon, while going through a new stack of expansion bids, I received a message from our senior partner that made me set down my coffee very slowly. The industry news had been tracking Northgate Capital Group's decline for months. Raymond had pushed an aggressive overseas expansion, one that analysts warned was premature. He ignored them. The expansion failed badly. 2 major clients pulled their accounts. Layoffs followed. The stock price dropped steadily. Raymond held press interviews where he blamed market conditions and global uncertainty. He never once admitted he had moved too fast or listened too little. I watched all of it from a distance, saying nothing. But privately, in board meetings, I started hearing a name come up in conversations about struggling firms looking for emergency funding. That name was Northgate Capital Group. and the number they needed was significant. Our senior partner, Mr. Osei, placed the shortlisted proposals on the conference table one Wednesday afternoon. There were 4 companies seeking a partnership contract that would stabilize their operations and open new funding lines. The kind of deal that could save a company that was close to collapse. I was halfway through the second file when I turned to the third. The logo was clean and familiar. The executive summary was written in the crisp, confident tone I had read in 100 internal memos. Northgate Capital Group. Raymond's company. His signature was at the bottom of the cover letter. I set the file down carefully. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up at the ceiling and took a slow breath. I read every page of Raymond's proposal that night at home. The arrogance was still there, buried inside professional language, but unmistakable. He wrote about disciplined leadership and zero tolerance for distraction. He wrote about results-driven culture and accountability at every level. I almost laughed out loud. I thought about the woman he fired while her mother was on a ventilator. I thought about how fast my email access was cut. And then I thought about something more useful. He had no idea who sat on our approval board. He had submitted this proposal to the firm that held his company's last lifeline, and he did not know I was there. I decided not to tell him. Not yet. We began our standard due diligence process on all 4 companies. When the team reached Northgate, the picture that emerged was worse than the public report suggested. The overseas expansion had cost them far more than disclosed. They had delayed payments to 2 vendors. Their cash reserves had dropped to a point where they could not sustain operations past the next quarter without outside funding. One of our analysts summarized it plainly. This company is not struggling, it is sinking. The contract on our table was not a growth opportunity for Northgate. It was a rescue. Without it, Raymond's company, the one he ran with such loud confidence, would not survive the year. The one thing standing between him and collapse was our signature. Raymond's team formally requested an in-person presentation. Standard process. The presenting company would come to our offices, walk us through their proposal, and answer questions from the board. I reviewed the request with Mr. Osei. He asked if I had any concerns about Northgate joining the shortlist. I told him I had a prior professional connection to the company and would need to disclose that before the meeting. He appreciated the honesty. He also asked if I felt I could evaluate them fairly. I told him I could. That was the truth. I didn't want emotion in that room. I wanted clarity. I approved the meeting, confirmed the date, and made one quiet personal decision. My name would not appear in any communication sent to Raymond's team beforehand. I prepared for that meeting the way I used to prepare for the most important client presentations at Northgate. Except this time, I was on the other side of the table. I reviewed every number in their proposal twice. I identified 3 inconsistencies in their projected growth figures. I prepared questions that were professional, specific, and impossible to answer vaguely. And then I prepared one sentence. Just one. I didn't write it down. I didn't need to. I had been carrying it in the back of my mind since the day I stood in that hospital hallway, phone pressed to my ear, listening to a man tell me that business doesn't pause for personal problems. I knew exactly when I would say it. And I knew exactly how I would say it. Quietly, without anger, without drama. Raymond walked into our boardroom like a man who had already won. He wore a sharp charcoal suit. He had 2 associates with him, both carrying leather folders. He shook hands around the table with the smooth confidence of someone used to controlling rooms. He introduced himself. He thanked us for our time. He adjusted his cufflinks and opened his presentation folder. I was seated at the head of the table. He had not looked directly at me yet. He began speaking. Projections, timelines, strategic alignment. His voice was steady and polished. Then he glanced toward me to make eye contact with the board chair. His voice did not stop immediately, but his eyes did. For just a second, Raymond Holt looked like a man who had walked into a room and found the floor missing. He recovered quickly. I will give him that. He blinked, looked back at his notes, and kept talking. But something had shifted in the room that everyone could feel even if they didn't know why. His sentences became slightly shorter. He moved through slides faster than planned. One of his associates glanced at him. Confused by the change in pace, I said nothing. I let him continue. I made small notes on the pad in front of me. When he reached the slide on projected returns, he paused just a half-second too long before reading the number. It was the slide with the inconsistency I had already found. He stumbled, just barely, over his own figure. The room noticed. Raymond knew the room noticed, and he knew I had noticed first. When he finished, I spoke. I asked him to clarify the growth projection on page 11 of the proposal. The figure assumed a 22% client retention improvement over 18 months, with no explanation of how that would be achieved. Raymond answered smoothly at first. Then I asked a follow-up, and another. Each question went one layer deeper into the numbers. His associates stopped making eye contact with anyone. By the fourth question, Raymond's jaw was tight. He was not used to being interrogated by someone who knew his company's structure from the inside. He was not used to someone already knowing which answers didn't add up. He looked at me once with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the same look he gave junior employees he considered beneath him. I met it calmly and waited for his answer. While he was speaking, I allowed myself one moment, just one, to remember the word he had used about me in a performance review 2 years ago. Replaceable. He had written it in the comments section after I missed a team dinner because my mother was having cardiac tests. Imani shows good technical ability but has demonstrated she is ultimately replaceable. I had read that word sitting alone in my car and felt it land like a hand pressed flat against my chest. Now I sat at the head of a table that held the keys to his company's survival, and I thought about that word again. The difference between then and now was not revenge. It was simply that the truth had finally caught up with the story he had been telling about both of us. When Raymond's presentation concluded, the room was quiet for a moment. Mr. Osei looked at the board, then turned to me. Imani, as lead on this shortlist, do you have a recommendation? Every face in the room turned toward me. Raymond's 2 associates looked at their folders. Raymond looked at me directly, and for the first time that day, his expression wasn't controlled. There was something under the surface of it, something close to fear. Not of failure, of me specifically, of what I might say, of what I might know, of what I might do with the position I was sitting in. I let the silence hold for just a moment longer than was necessary. Then I placed my hands flat on the table and looked at him. Before I give my recommendation, I said, I want to be transparent with this board. I was previously employed at Northgate Capital Group for 6 years. I was terminated by Mr. Holt while I was at the hospital with my critically ill mother. The room went very still. I continued. At the time, Mr. Holt told me something I've thought about often. I looked at Raymond directly. His face had gone pale. He said, business doesn't pause for personal problems. I paused. I want the board to know that I intend to apply that same standard to this evaluation. This is a business decision. I will not let our history influence my professional judgment either way. Raymond said nothing. His jaw was tight. He looked like a man watching a fire he started burn toward him. The presentation ended and the board took a short recess. I was gathering my notes when Raymond appeared at my side. Imani, he said quietly, can we speak privately? I followed him into the hallway. He ran a hand across his face. He looked tired in a way that his polished suit couldn't hide. I owe you an apology, he said. I waited. What I did, that call, it was wrong. I was under pressure, and I made a decision I've regretted. He looked at me carefully, trying to read my face. I know this isn't the right moment, but I hope you can consider the full picture of what our company is offering. There are 200 jobs depending on this contract. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. It was also 8 months too late. He didn't stop at the apology. Raymond Holt, the man who had never once acknowledged my contributions during 6 years of employment, now offered me 3 things in a hushed hallway conversation. A senior advisory role at Northgate if we approved the contract, an enhanced compensation structure for my family's firm, and the promise that he would make things right between us personally. He held eye contact the entire time, using the same focused attention he gave to high-value clients. I recognized the technique. I had watched him use it in meetings for years. He was not offering those things out of guilt. He was offering them because he was afraid. And fear, not remorse, was driving every word. I returned to the boardroom and gave my recommendation clearly and without emotion. Northgate's financials showed structural instability that went beyond what their proposal acknowledged. Their projected recovery timeline was based on assumptions that our analysts could not verify. Two of the other shortlisted companies offered stronger fundamentals and more transparent reporting. I recommended that we decline Northgate's proposal and advance the two stronger candidates. Mr. Osei asked if I was confident in the recommendation given my prior history with the company. I told him the prior history was exactly why I was being careful to let the numbers speak. The board voted. The decision was unanimous. Raymond Holt walked out of our building without a contract, without a lifeline, without me. The weeks that followed moved quickly for Northgate. Without the funding partnership they had been counting on, their options narrowed fast. They attempted to approach two other investment groups, but word moves in this industry, and our declining their proposal had signaled something the market read clearly. One major institutional investor quietly withdrew. Then a second. Raymond issued a statement about strategic restructuring that convinced no one who understood the real numbers. Internally, I heard through former colleagues that morale had collapsed. Senior staff were updating their resumes. Key client relationships were being handed off to competitors. The company Raymond had run with such certainty was losing its shape from the inside out. 3 months after our board meeting, Northgate Capital Group's own board of directors convened an emergency session. The agenda included one item: leadership change. Raymond Holt was removed as CEO. The announcement was brief and carefully worded, the kind that says everything by saying almost nothing. The board has accepted Mr. Holt's resignation, effective immediately. I read the news alert on my phone while sitting in my mother's kitchen, drinking tea. She asked me what I was reading. I told her it was work news. She nodded and asked if I wanted more tea. I said yes. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was turning golden. It was an ordinary moment, and it felt like exactly the right place to receive that news. Our firm moved forward with the two companies we had selected. Both partnerships performed well inside the first quarter. My mother attended a small dinner we held to mark the firm's 35th anniversary. The first family event she had been well enough to attend in over a year. She sat at the table in a green dress she loved, laughing at something Mr. Osei said, and I watched her from across the room and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph, not satisfaction in the way revenge is supposed to feel. Just peace, the quiet kind. The kind that comes when the right things are finally in their right places and the people who matter are still in the room with you. Raymond never contacted me again. I didn't expect him to. The last I heard, he had taken a mid-level consulting role at a small firm outside of Atlanta. A long fall from the corner office where he once fired people over the phone. I don't think about him often. What I think about is the hospital hallway, the ventilator humming, my hands pressed flat against the wall. The moment I decided I would not beg. That decision didn't destroy Raymond Holt. He did that on his own, one choice at a time, long before I ever sat at the head of that table. All I did was show up. I let the numbers speak. I let the truth hold its own weight. And when the moment came, I didn't pause.